Coming up on CarAdvice, Holden, Ford and Toyota. How are the big three faring 12 months after the last car rolled off an Australian production line?
If you feel the need for speed, supercar price tags have traditionally placed them out of the reach of mere mortals. However, are McLaren and Audi changing the game with the 540C and the R8?
And diesel or petrol, we weigh up the benefits to help you decide which fuel source suits your lifestyle.
Welcome to Car Advice. I'm Trent, Nikolic. Another big show for you this evening, including Holden, Ford and Toyota. We're going to take a look at the traditional big three in Australia and see how they're faring 12 months after local manufacturing stopped. McLaren and Audi, we're going to ask the question about whether they're democratising supercar ownership. Sounds a little crazy, but bear with us, we'll get there. Diesel or petrol? Which fuel source is a better choice for you for everyday driving? A senior road test editor at CarAdvice, Paul Maric, joining me again.
Hello, Trent.
Good to have you here, mate. And here he is, everybody's mate, everybody's tech mate, Elon Musk. Why is there a big picture of him over my shoulder?
Look, he's in a bit of hot water lately.
Yeah, for a change.
Yeah, this guy's a genius.
Good at it.
He is a genius. Yeah. He's made a lot of big companies and they've made a lot of money, but he's just landed in a bit of hot water, and that's because he tweeted some stuff recently that he wasn't allowed to, and we discussed this in a previous episode, but he alleged that the company was going to be taken private and that he had secured funding. Well, guess what? Not allowed to do that.
Shouldn't really do that, should you? Not
absolutely.
via Twitter anyway.
Absolutely not. So the SEC stepped in and charged Elon Musk with fraud, and he has settled with the SEC. He's agreed to step down as chairman of the company, but will retain a CEO-ship of Tesla. And he's also going to have to pay $20 million out of his own pocket in fines, plus Tesla will have to pay $20 million as well. So it is a big penalty here, but it's on the back of some positive news for the brand. They've announced that they have produced 80,000 cars.
Oh, that's good.
In the third quarter.
Yeah, so Model 3's on their way to Australia?
No, not quite.
Not quite yet.
Despite the fact 55,000 of those were Model 3s,
yeah.
We still have no idea when it's coming to Australia. We also have no idea when the $35,000 Model 3, which is the one that built up all the hype,
and everyone wants to talk about. We don't know where that is. The other thing too, the reason this is a big deal for us is because there are people out there, mum and dad investors, who've put all their savings into, you know, Tesla shares. They've committed their savings to this company. They believe in what Elon Musk is doing and saying. And at CarAdvice, we respect the technology, don't we? We're big fans of it. We respect where the company's going. But he needs to toe the line in a corporate sense, as we've seen there with those tweets. And with that 80,000 cars, you know, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, we'd like to see the Model 3 here, but they have to start delivering these cars, don't they?
Yeah, they do. And look, you're right about the mum and dad investors, because for someone like him who's a billionaire, $20 million.
That's like a slap on the wrist,
It's like you buying me a coffee or something, which rarely happens.
Yeah,
but
I'd never do that.
It's for him, it's nothing. And you know, in all honesty, you can't be doing this type of thing, especially when people's savings sort of rely on it. So,
yeah, absolutely. On the subject of Ford, I'm on the record as saying that the Endura, I think, is one of the most awful names in cars currently. There's some stupid names out there. On the good side, they've actually, I think it looks pretty good. I reckon it looks good. And they've actually announced the starting price.
So this car here, just for a bit of background, is based on the Ford Edge. That car was recently updated, and that is the car that's coming to Australia. It replaces the Ford Territory, which is the car that we know and love. Starting price of just under $45,000 plus on-road costs. So it is good value for money, but the thing I find confusing is that it's not available with 7 seats. It doesn't have as much room as the Ford Territory.
300 litres less than a Territory, and that's not great news because the Territory was reasonably compact inside for a large SUV anyway. And I think that starting price is great, 45 grand, but we've discussed before on caradvice.com that a lot of the problem with Ford product at the moment is when you start adding some options to it or getting higher up the model tree, it costs a lot of money, doesn't it?
Yeah, this goes all the way up to about $70,000. I mean, that's entry-level Benz money. That's a lot of cash.
It's a lot of cash.
But under the bonnet, it will be powered by a 2-litre diesel exclusively, so 140 kilowatts of power, 400 newton metres of torque. So that's really, really impressive there in terms of the power and torque output.
Why did we get stuck with Endura? Why could it not have been called Edge here? Tell the viewers why that happened, because Edge would have been a hell of a lot better than Endura.
You'll never believe this, but Edge in Australia was going to work until Ford did a search and found out that, yes, Toyota in fact owns the trademark for Edge. They knocked on the door of Toyota and said, hey, can we have the Edge trademark?
And Toyota said?
No, they said,
no.
Not a chance.
Not a chance.
So that's how we ended up with Enduro, and it fits the bill for Ford SUVs. So all Ford SUVs start with an E. Everest, Escape, Explorer. You know,
some people call the Explorer an exploder.
Careful.
Yeah,
so that's the reason they've gone with Enduro. So kind of makes sense when you think of it that way.
One of my cars of the year, Paul. Huge fan of this vehicle. Got a lot of respect for it. Historically, it's been around for a long time.
Transformers.
Transformers, exactly. Chevrolet Camaro, just in case you're wondering what we're talking about. I love it. 6.2 litre V8 engine, 339 kilowatts, 617 Newton metres of torque. They've announced pricing. I initially said I thought it would be closer to $100,000, but they've announced pricing starting from...
You'll never believe this. Just under $86,000 plus on-road costs.
So I was wrong.
Well, add your on-road costs and it's pretty much $100 grand. You're not going to get much change from 100, but it does signal a new start for the HSV brand in Australia, because this is a brand that you and I were both convinced would be dead in the water, because they went from holding Commodores and making them faster to nothing, because they're not touching the new Commodore, but they have reinvigorated this space by converting cars in Australia.
And it's a big deal. HSV, which used to work specifically with Holden, has now gone out and it's broadened its portfolio. So they started out with Ram pickup trucks, 25 and 3500. They've recently added Ram 1500 to that. We've tested all those. They're great. Now they've added the Chevrolet product there as well. So 2500 and 3500 Silverado and Camaro. The problem I think Australian buyers have is that this isn't priced competitively to the Mustang, but there's a reason for that. Low volume compliance and conversion costs a hell of a lot of money. And you reckon it's cost, what, about $30,000, is that right, just to engineer one to right-hand drive?
I mean, it's crazy. They bring it in left-hand drive. They literally pull this thing completely apart, throw away half the bits, put new bits on, and then it's a right-hand drive car. The positive thing is that they have backing here from Chevrolet. So they're doing this under, I guess, the guidance of the proper engineering drawings, and we know what the product's going to be like. I've driven this thing overseas. It is sensational. The noise, it will blow you away. But the fact that it costs so much more than a Mustang, I think, will upset some people because it is considerably more here, but the same price in the US.
Local manufacturing, those two words there are guaranteed to generate more heated debate at a barbecue than any other in the car world, pretty much, especially in Australia. 12 months ago, about 12 to 18 months ago in some instances, you would have seen a lot of stuff on CarAdvice.com about the last Falcon rolling off the assembly line, same for Camry, same for Holden Commodore. At the time, we reported that a lot of people lost their jobs, a lot of Australians lost their jobs, but that's the reality when things close down. And I find this really interesting. Believe me, I understand emotions with cars. I know you do. Cars are an emotive subject, but I don't think there was any outpouring of emotion when we stopped producing wheelbarrows or cigarette packets or, you know, tyres or whatever it is that we used to build here. But all of a sudden, we've stopped manufacturing cars and the world has ended seemingly for people.
I know, but the thing is here that the car has a really strong connection to Australia.
We're linked to it, yeah.
I mean, we started manufacturing cars
the 40s.
Yeah, I mean, it was a long time ago.
Yep.
We invented the Ute.
We did.
The Ford invented the Ute. So, I mean, this is a real heritage link to Australia. And when you have cars like that rolling down the production line, naturally aspirated V8s that are incredibly fun to drive, you do get emotional. It is emotional for me. I had family in the car industry as well.
You did.
But fact of the matter is we weren't producing cars that people were buying. A lot of people complain today that the new Commodore that's imported doesn't have a V8, not going to buy it. Well, guess what? You never actually bought those. So that's why
30% of people were buying the V8 towards the end of production. And yeah, you can argue that 30% of people are therefore V8 buyers, but 70% weren't. Now, the point you just made there, for me, is the big one. These manufacturers, if you leave Toyota out with Camry, because it still had quite high fleet sales, so people are still interested in Camry. It's still selling quite well now. But if you look at Ford and Holden specifically, and they're the ones that Australians have a real emotional attachment to, they simply were not building cars for the last decade or so that people were interested in. Australians are buying medium and large SUVs. They weren't building them in Australia. When they did...
Ford was.
Territory. When they did build a Territory, that of course came with a diesel engine, didn't it?
Except there was a small problem.
And it came with diesel engine 10 years after it started.
And the diesel engine that it came with was around 10 years old. So it was an equation that simply wasn't going to work. So if you're not going to invest money in updating it, people aren't going to buy it.
They're not going to buy it. And I've just spent some time with BMW overseas, ironically enough, at their electric vehicle plant, so where they're building i3 and i8. Now, you want to talk about a vision for the future and ensuring that you have a business case that moves forward. Where were Holden and Ford with their hybrid and electric vehicle options?
Nowhere to be found.
I
mean, Ford did give it a crack with Falcon and Eco LPI, so working on gas, which was an Australian, resource, but that didn't work out. We didn't see it advertised anywhere, so it was a real failure on their part. Look, we can cut it 1,000 ways, but at the end of the day, it was costing too much to produce these cars locally. And we have discussed before that a lot of this had to do with the cost of employing people in Australia. Cost of living in Australia is high. Cost of employing a labourer is astronomical. And when you're selling these cars, it just doesn't add up.
And I think there's also a separate argument as well that the assembly line workers, and we don't like anybody losing their job. We absolutely don't. But if you're disproportionately high paid for the skill level that you are relative to other industries, there's always going to be a problem with that. That was part of the argument. I think the bigger picture, though, still is about the cars they were building that people didn't want to buy anymore. But the interesting thing with these figures we've seen recently is that the end of local manufacturing hasn't really hurt these three big manufacturers as badly as we thought it would.
Let's put some numbers into context here. So General Motors Holden, which is the division of Holden in Australia, generated $156.8 million after tax profit for 2017. So that included a period of final production. Ford, on the other hand, had an after-tax profit of $27 million. Now, that may not sound like much, but let me put some of these numbers into context. Just in 2013, Ford posted a $267 million loss.
Massive,
so it is a big difference there. Toyota as well, they've actually done a really good job in Australia.
Just before you get to Toyota, though, we're with Ford specifically. They've got a really good portfolio of vehicles that people want to buy. You know, we've spoken about Holden and how they're struggling with their sales. You know, Commodore, for example, the new one, is a good vehicle, but it's struggling to put forward a compelling reason as to why you should buy it. However, over at Ford, you've got things like Focus, ST and RS. You've got the Ford Ranger and now Ranger Raptor coming, and of course Mustang. People want these cars in big numbers.
Yeah, that's it. And that's where these companies are now evolving. So Ford Australia is investing big dollars in local R&D. And we've seen that with the likes of the Ranger. The T6 platform was designed and engineered in Australia, same with Everest. And Ford has invested almost $500 million in local R&D. So that's putting a lot of confidence behind the operation. Toyota's doing the same thing. They're investing a lot in R&D, and so is Holden. We're seeing a lot of Holden products in Australia that are engineered in Australia for Australian conditions, and we're seeing a lot of engineering of global V6 products done right here in Australia. So it is good news.
I love this comment from Ford as well, that they're now Australia's largest auto employer with over 2,000 highly skilled professionals, including the team that leads the design and engineering of the Ranger, Ranger Raptor and Everest for Australia and the rest of the world. And we spoke earlier about Camaro in the show, where the previous generation Camaro was on an Australian platform. But Range is a perfect example. These engineers in Australia have the skill set to build a car that goes globally, don't they?
Exactly. So it is really good news there. And the thing that we never really got right was exports. We exported a few cars to the Middle East, and I know if you ever watched Homeland, you would have seen Ford territories there.
That's right.
But Toyota really heralded that with 25,000 vehicles exported during the last financial year. So they were doing it well, but just not enough, and it landed us in this position where it wasn't viable anymore. Will we get back to making wheelbarrows, or what's going to happen?
Things look pretty good at the moment for those three manufacturers. We had a really tough week in the CarAdvice office, not too long ago. And do you know what constitutes a tough week in the CarAdvice office?
Tell me, Trent.
When you've got a McLaren 540C and an Audi R8. So when you've got nearly $1 million worth of supercars in the garage, that's tough. And the reason it's tough is because we have to spend that week driving them. Now, I know that you've driven both of them. There's a really interesting reason that we went with this comparison test. Go to caradvice.com, have a look at the comparison. Kurt's done an excellent job of it. And tell us whether you agree with where we were going. So what we were doing was we were having a look at what's considered a supercar these days, but also what McLaren and Audi have offered as their entry-level supercar. So first of all, is an Audi R8 a supercar or a sports car?
Okay, so before you get onto your keyboards and start throwing them through your TV, yes, that's a McLaren 720S, not a 540C.
It is.
But to answer your question, I don't know. I reckon it is.
Yeah, I think
And
it
I'll
is
tell
too.
you why.
I think it is. Just before you do, the reason we got a 720S there is because that's a really expensive McLaren supercar. The 540C, the one we had, was priced at just over $300,000.
Yep.
So 325. The Audi R8 RWS, which doesn't stand for rear wheel steering. What does it stand for?
Rear wheel series. So
Right.
it's the first ever rear wheel drive Audi, and they've decided to debut it in this thing.
And the one we had was $299,500. So you're talking around about that $300,000 mark. Yes, it's a lot of money, but it's not $600,000 or $700,000, is it?
No, exactly.
Yeah.
So, look, I think the R8 is a supercar, and simply because you've got a V10 engine, no car with a V10 engine that sounds as good as that is going to be a not supercar. So it certainly meets the brief. But where they delineate completely is the way that they drive. Your Audi is more your everyday supercar, whereas the McLaren, I think, takes a different approach.
Yeah, it does take a different approach, and we'll look at some numbers in a minute. But I think when we go from a sports car, which is probably a lot of the variations of 911 before you get right up the top, they're sports cars. Then we say supercars are things like Lambo Huracan, R8, this base McLaren, those kinds of vehicles. Then we step up now to hypercar, which is the really, really silly high end of stuff. Some manufacturers like McLaren, I would argue, go between both. So the McLaren Senna is a hypercar, but this thing's a supercar. The numbers are really, really quite incredible when you think about it. So the Audi R8, 397 kilowatts, 540 newton metres, and what you just mentioned, that 5.2 litre naturally aspirated V10 engine, that it just sounds unbelievable. That car is just an incredible thing to drive, isn't it?
Absolutely. And what actually takes it even better is that they do a convertible version.
That's right.
I had the chance to recently drive the V10 Plus, which is the top spec model, through some Swiss Alps, and it sounded absolutely incredible, especially with that roof off. The car is more about noise than it is about its handling dynamics, and that's proven in the fact that it doesn't generate peak power or torque until quite far up in the rev range, so you have to rev it out, and it revs out to over 8,000 RPM, so it is ballistic, and getting 8,000 RPM out of a V10 engine is almost unheard of, whereas McLaren takes a different approach with a turbocharged V8. In fact, most of the McLaren engines are virtually the same engine, just with different power
variations
outputs.
of. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the big key there. You know, for viewers who don't understand the difference between engine characteristics, you'll see in a lot of car advice reviews when we talk about power delivery the word linear, which is just a really flat, smooth. It's a way of describing a really never-ending almost power delivery where there's no hole. And the naturally aspirated V10 in the Audi is one of the all-time great engines.
Absolutely.
You know, in terms of talking about engines that should be listed as some of the best ever, that's one of the best engines that's ever been built of any configuration. But the way it just keeps pumping out power right through that rev range up to redline, never ending, whereas the twin turbo system in the McLaren is a completely different beast. It feels like you've got to drive it a lot harder. Kurt and I, we did the road testing of these, and we went to a couple of B roads where it was kind of bumpy, the sort of stuff you'd do if you went for a drive on a Saturday or a Sunday. And sure, the power delivery and how quick these things are is the headline act, but the reality is if you're buying this car, you want to be able to drive it regularly. And for me, the way that they behave day to day, the way that you can use them day to day, is really impressive. You know, I said recently in a review that the R8 really took the fight up to Porsche in terms of usable performance cars that you can actually live with day to day.
Yeah. McLaren, on the other hand, not so much.
Not so much.
I mean, that 720S, I drove that exact car just recently, and I found that doing the day-to-day thing was really painful. So you've got doors that open kind of stupidly, so if you're in a car park, you can't really open them.
Exactly.
You've got a very low front end. It can be fiddly to use the infotainment system at times, and while it has this immense power and ability behind the wheel, it's just hard to unleash it because it's constantly trying to kill you. Especially,
So
I mean, you and I are not race drivers by any stretch.
No.
And to get the most out of something like that McLaren, you need a big open racetrack. You need to have someone with a lot of ability. And I feel that just for the average driver, it's just a little too menacing. Whereas the Audi, for example, you can pop my wife or your mum behind the wheel and you could drive it around the corner and it'd be perfectly fine.
Yeah, there's nothing intimidating about it at all. For me, it's a bit of a philosophical argument too, because the interesting thing with the R8, and Kurt wrote this in the review, that he found and we found that the R8 is actually, in rear-wheel drive guys, probably the smartest R8 to buy.
Absolutely.
It's actually really good value for money and it's a great thing to drive. However, the reason I say it's a philosophical thing for me is that Audi has led the way with its quattro all-wheel drive system for decades now, across a whole range of different platforms. And for me, I'm wondering whether I could buy Audi's quintessential supercar that's not all-wheel drive, even though it's probably a smarter way to spend the money. Would you not want an all-wheel drive car? That's the question.
Yeah, well, that's the problem. This is a better car in a rear-wheel drive configuration, and the heritage behind that is that Stefan Winkelmann, who was the boss of Lamborghini, became the head of Audi Sport, which is the division that builds the RS cars and cars like the R8. And he said, well, you know what we're going to do? We're going to take a bit of Lambo and chuck it in this, because that's what they did with a lot of the Huracan special editions. And they created this car, and it's been a hit. 999 units is what it's limited to, but they're all sold out. So I don't know. I reckon they've hit a really good formula, and I'm hoping we see more rear-wheel drive Audis coming.
Look, we love your feedback, as you know. Now, this was obviously a hell of a lot of fun to do this test, but there's two things yeah, it was hard work. There's two things we'd love your feedback on. Tell us what you think a hypercar or a supercar is, and whether the Audi R8 and the McLaren 540 is a supercar. And then tell us whether you can stomach the idea of an entry-level supercar, or whether you're not even interested at all, you just want $1 million in your dream bank account, and you go and buy the most expensive one you can get. Diesel versus petrol. We get asked this question all the time. It's a constant on all the various forms of media. Should I buy this car in a diesel or a petrol? There's a couple of reasons that we discuss this and we answer these questions often, because a lot of people really aren't sure what it means to them if they're going to buy a diesel engine vehicle. Yeah,
because obviously diesel is fuel efficient. That's the mentality. And petrol isn't fuel efficient. So this is what people step into the game with. And we're finding that they fall into some traps, and the common traps are, if you go for a diesel car, you're not travelling enough to actually benefit from the extra cost. Diesel's generally more expensive. They're generally more expensive to service. And then on top of that, some of them are fitted with a device called a diesel particulate filter. And this is a device that requires servicing and maintenance on occasion.
That's it.
And it's also a device that cleans itself. But the caveat is that it only cleans itself after the car's regularly driven. So these are things that people need to watch out for.
And when you see, you know, a 4 or 5 year old diesel vehicle running around town chugging out reams of black smoke, that's what's happened. The diesel particulate filter is clogged. It's not doing the job it's supposed to be doing. And then it's putting that soot out into the air. So the reality is that for a lot of people these days, in 2018, the way these vehicles have been designed, diesel doesn't make as much sense. Now, if you're towing, if you're doing a lot of heavy duty off-road work, or you're talking about large or upper large SUVs,
or lots of Ks,
or lots of kilometres, we'd almost always recommend a diesel. However, with a medium SUV like the Tiguan, I've just finished driving the 132 TSI, so the petrol, and it's excellent. It's really, really good. We found that the fuel economy was down in the high 10s around town. You get it below 10 on the motorway, which isn't too bad. And we've also read reports recently. A lot of people that tow big caravans have said that petrol Land Cruisers, 200 series for example, don't actually use that much more fuel per litre than the diesel anyway. So I think the message there is that unless you're doing a lot of kilometres and you can justify it, diesel's not always the best option.
Exactly. You're looking at less maintenance there as well. And generally a petrol engine will give you a bit more oomph throughout the rev band. So you're not waiting for it to come on boost, which is when that turbocharger kicks in. And with a lot of new technology these days and these mild hybrid systems that we're talking about often, you get all of that, the gap feeling that you wouldn't otherwise have with a diesel. So if you are looking at an SUV, we urge you to have a look at the numbers. So in terms of kilometres travelled, if you're doing more than around the 30,000 kilometres a year mark, that's when you can veer towards a diesel and see if it's cost effective in terms of your length of ownership. But if you aren't, stick with the petrol. It's going to be better around town. It'll give you the pep that you need when the family's on board. And as always, I mean, we tell everyone, make sure you do your 24-hour test drive.
Absolutely.
And the reason we say that is if you take a car like the Tiguan home and it doesn't fit in the garage, you're not going to find that out.
Won't matter whether it's diesel or petrol, will it?
So don't go for a lap around the block with the dealer. Make sure you take it home, make sure it suits the family, and everyone in the family loves it.
A lot of things have changed as well in the last few years. So a lot of people didn't like the idea of diesel because the Bowsers were messy and oily, and you know, you didn't like the idea
They still are.
They still can be, and you didn't like the idea of getting diesel all over your hands when you were filling up. But petrol engines and the way they perform with the turbocharging, the injection systems, the way they deliver their power, they've got that real chunky mid-range power delivery that diesels used to deliver that everybody loved. So petrol engines' characteristics have become a lot more like that, and then they do tend to keep working harder towards redline than a diesel will as well. But I think the message there is really about the money, isn't it? If you're going to save money, and you know you're going to save money by owning a petrol, it's obviously the way to go.
Yeah, you know where diesels really make a lot of sense and petrols really don't, and that's in the dual cab ute segment. And you'll find that the petrol engines are generally limited to the very base models because they'll either be naturally aspirated or very small engines that aren't suitable for towing. So that's why with dual cab utes you are sort of veering towards a diesel. But with SUVs we urge you to just check how much you're travelling each year and then reduce your cost of ownership by choosing the right engine choice.
Any questions you want answered, keep sending your emails there because we love getting them and we love helping you out where we can. That's all we've got time for this evening. Paul, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We will see you again next Wednesday night at 8:30 on Your Money. Thanks for joining us at CarAdvice.